We are beginning a new section in the adult class, and this one is going to be on issues at the ending of life. It is going to be practical, theological, ethical, and perhaps a few other things that I haven't even imagined. This week and next week, I'm going to try to bring you into the world of ethics at the end of life. And in order to do that, we need to start by trying to get some understanding of various terms, various ethical theories, various principles that come into play when we start talking about ethics at the ending of life. There are a number of handouts on your table. There's a single two-sided sheet with a heading, Ethics at the Ending of Life. There is one copy of that for anybody and everybody at the table. And that's sort of the outline of where we're going to be going this week and next week. You will also find on your table 4 sheets, or packets, I guess I should say, and there's probably only 2 of those. One is entitled Life, one is entitled Right, one is entitled Good, and the last one is entitled Death. Now, there's only 2 of each of those, and that's because there was so much information, I decided not to make a copy of this for everybody. On the other hand, if you peruse through it and you would like a copy, I can arrange for you to have a copy at the end of class. But I figured some of these, some people weren't going to want to read through, and so I didn't make copies of these 4 packets for every person. All right? At the end of the class, if you want to take all 4 of them home, feel free to. If you aren't interested in them, that's perfectly fine. One last housekeeping thing before we get going. As you know, the bishop is coming for his annual visitation on April 7th, which will be the Sunday after Easter. Anybody who is interested in being confirmed in the Episcopal Church, interested in being received into the Episcopal Church, or reaffirming their baptismal covenant, Ben and I need to know who you are. And in order to find out who you are, there is a form. It is on that table as you head out the door. It is on top of those Bibles. It looks like this. We'd like to have them back by March 1st. That does not sign your name in blood to show up in front of the bishop on April 7th, but we need to get an idea for the bishop of who might want to be confirmed, received, or reaffirmed. Now, there's an explanation. You got an email this week with regard to that, and there's an explanation of those terms in today's bulletin. So I encourage you to take home a bulletin. If you think you're interested, grab a form for the information that we need and continue to pray about that. As the bulletin said, participation in this class over the course of this year is a foundation for anybody who wants to be confirmed or who wants to be received. And if you have questions about that, see me at the end of class, email Ben or me, talk to one of us after the 10:17, call us, whatever. Okay? All right. We're going to define a lot of terms today. So fasten your seatbelts. Ethics. These are the standards of behavior which tell us how we should act in situations. What I want to do right now is start with what ethics is not. Ethics is not feelings. Now, feelings are important, so don't get me wrong. But You can feel good even when you're doing something wrong. You can feel very uncomfortable if you are doing the right thing and it's a hard thing to do. So ethics is not feelings. Ethics is not religion. While most religions encourage high ethical standards, ethics also applies to folks who are not religious. Ethics is not the law. Now, legal systems generally, frequently incorporate many ethical standards. But the law can deviate from ethical standards. For example, think about a totalitarian state. And the law may, at times, serve the interests of a narrow group and put it in conflict with ethics. Ethics is not culturally accepted norms. Some cultures are quite ethical. Some are not. Sometimes a culture can become blind to certain ethical concerns. Witness, perhaps, a country that endorses slavery. And when in Rome, do what the Romans do, is not a satisfactory ethical standard. Ethics is not science. Science provides important data for making ethical decisions, but it is not the job of science to tell us what we should do. It can be very hard at times to identify ethical standards. So if they're not based on feelings, religion, law, culturally accepted norms, science, then what? Well, that's where we're going to get into a few of the main ethical theories. I'm going to describe them for you in a shorthand fashion. You can obviously go and Google them and read about them in great detail. The first one to mention is the utilitarian approach. That says that the ethical action is the one that provides the greatest good or the least harm for the greatest number. Utilitarianism deals with consequences or end results, and it always tries to increase the good and minimize the harm. The rights approach, which can be called deontology, but they are complementary, let's put it that way. The rights approach says that the ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the moral rights of those affected. The rights approach, deontology, says that all human beings have dignity, and that dignity is based on their human nature, on their ability to choose. And such dignity requires that an individual be treated as an end and not as a means to an end. The moral rights approach, which is part of both deontology and natural law, says that the ethical decision requires that people are able to make their own choices about the life that they are going to live. That people be told the truth. That people not be injured. and that people are entitled to a degree of privacy. Now, this gets widely debated. Indeed, there are some people that say that non-humans have rights. In other words, people who make the argument that our pets have rights. Rights, whether they are moral rights or whether they fall into the rights approach, rights imply duties. Indeed, rights imply a duty not just to myself or this person, but to all people. In deontology, its fundamental precept is called the categorical imperative, and it simply says this: act in such a way that your actions could become a universal truth. Act in such a way that your actions could become a universal truth. I failed to say earlier, I'm hitting you with a lot of stuff, so if something's not clear, throw your hand up and we'll answer the question. Another approach to making ethical decisions is called the fairness or the justice approach. Ethical actions should treat all people equally, is what this approach says. But if they will be treated unequally, it will be a fair decision based on some defensible standard. The common good approach says that ethical actions will contribute to the good of the community. And so the common good approach points to common conditions, the importance of welfare to all, meaning systems of law, police departments, fire departments. These are all part of the common good. The virtue approach says that ethical action should be consistent with certain ideal virtues which provide for the development of humanity. Virtues are the habits, the outlooks that enable us to act in accordance with the highest potential of our character. So they are things like honesty, courage, compassion, generosity, tolerance, love, fidelity, integrity. There is something called the social contract approach, which says that ethical actions are good when they support the social contract agreed upon by the society. Social contracts keep human beings from reverting to the wild. In support of a social contract, human beings agree to give up some rights for the benefit of the community. And then the last one that I want to say something about, but I'm going to say a bit more about it, is the natural law approach. I'm going to say a bit more about this, but I've realized something sort of interesting about being here in Massachusetts. I want to say more about natural law approach because the natural law approach to ethical decision making undergirds Roman Catholic healthcare systems. And then I woke up to the fact that I can't find a Roman Catholic healthcare system anywhere near us. However, it could also be undergirding a doctor who is a practicing Roman Catholic in terms of the decisions that he or she would make. So, we're going to look at natural law. We've heard about it. It comes to us from Thomas Aquinas. It begins with the observation that many things, including human beings, act for a purpose. Something that has no purpose has no point. Fulfilling your purpose is good. In fact, a thing or a person is perfected, is fulfilled insofar as it's fulfilling its purpose. God created human beings with a further purpose, says Thomas, and that is to glorify God Himself and to procreate. Each thing created by God has a natural inclination to act to fulfill its purpose. We human beings are a complicated hierarchy and network of purposes. Indeed, that network is our nature. What fits with the network of purposes in human beings is natural. Remember, glorify God, procreate. What doesn't, isn't. Fundamentally, natural law says when we are working properly, we have a natural inclination to follow our purpose. In other words, says Thomas, to choose good and avoid evil. On the basis of natural law, good is to be done and pursued, and evil to be avoided, and that is self-evident, i.e., natural. Hence, natural law. Everything that exists tries to keep itself in existence, says natural law, because continued existence is its natural purpose. Why? Because existence is good. Life is good. Life is indeed a basic good, which we naturally try to preserve. Now, says Aquinas, our understanding of what is good can be destroyed, to a certain extent, by our evil doing. And he says, emotions can darken our understanding of what is good. If you're not absolutely sure about that, I can safely say this in this room. Think back to when you were 15 or 16 and you were madly in love with somebody. And everybody said that's not the right person for you. But you were convinced it was good. I see all those smiles, so everybody can think back to being 15. Natural law says that bad societal habits make bad things seem good. Consequently, we might lack that natural inclination to the good. When we act directly against the basic good of human beings, we are choosing evil, says Aquinas. And we're avoiding the first principle of natural law, which is to do good and avoid evil. Thomas goes further, and he says that actions must be intentional, they must have an end, an aim, and they must have an object. Classic example that's thrown out in ethics classes. Robin Hood robs the rich to help the poor. Well, he's being intentional. He has an end. He's going to help the poor. Isn't that good? You're right, GB, to look suspicious.
That's his normal look.
I'm more like a politician.
But the politicians usually steal the money from the poor to line their pockets.
We're not going down that rabbit hole today. The object for Robin Hood is to acquire by force or by subterfuge what he does not own. The object is bad, so Robin's action is bad, says natural law. Now, let me stop for a minute and point out a utilitarian would possibly say at this point, but look at how many poor people there are in the world. And what's a few dollars taken from some rich people when it's going to help all of these poor people? Which brings us back to the greatest good for the greatest number. The rights theory, deontology says, the rights theory says everybody must be treated as an end and not a means to an end. Deontology says act in such a way that your actions could become a universal law. The virtue approach is saying that our actions should reflect the best character traits. So even if you don't want to use natural law, you find yourself where so many people find themselves when they're making ethical decisions, which is caught between various ethical approaches and then having to figure out how they're going to get to the right decision. And I used to say this in my classes, and I'll say it to you. This is all why ethical decision making is not for the faint-hearted. It requires more than just, I love you. Or it requires more than just science says. Or at times, more than just my denomination says. Unless you're going to push all the way through that to get back to the source, which Thomas has told us again and again is God. The other thing that Aquinas tells us is that the means that we use can also be important. You could say that Robin Hood took the wrong means to achieve a good end. And we've heard people make this argument. Objects can potentially be neutral. But if an object of an action, for example, is the death of a person, not duly sentenced to death, the object is intrinsically wrong. And this is where we get into many debates about pulling the plug. An action whose object is intrinsically wrong, says Aquinas, is never acceptable, is never good. Another example. The action is to help someone carry a heavy item to their car. Pretty straightforward action. The end that we're trying to achieve is to help that person relieve the burden of carrying this heavy object all by themselves. And our object, of course, is to get this thing into the car. The end is good. The object has no real moral sway to it in any way. However, the person is a robber stealing a flat screen TV. Our action is wrong because we are now abetting a crime. And Thomas says this also means that we have to consider circumstances. So once again, we're right back to the fact that ethical decision-making is not for the faint-hearted. Because if we were to just follow Thomas's thinking, we have to consider the action, the end, the object, the means, and the circumstances.
Do you get any credit for not knowing?
If Thomas were here, I think he might argue that there are situations in which you might not know, and so therefore your action might not be inherently wrong. But Thomas would also say, if the window to the Best Buy is broken, and there's this guy walking out with a flat screen TV, that the circumstances might suggest that he didn't pay cash for it. I think.
So now what in the case of the boyfriend taking the flat screen TV out of, his girlfriend's apartment, and it's not his, but you don't know that. He just says, I'll get this in my car, and my buddy bailed on me, but you don't know that it's his girlfriend's TV.
I think that's one of those circumstances where Thomas would say that with that kind of incomplete information, we can't morally say that the action is inherently wrong, intrinsically wrong. But Thomas would ask us to examine our consciences deeper about what we know about the scenario.
Obviously, like thinking birds and passerby.
Right. Okay. All of this brings us to two questions which get at the heart of almost any ethical approach that we would try to take to any kind of decision making, whether it's at the end of life or whether it's as we go through life. Those two questions are what is good and what is right. Now, if I had to guess, you're probably sitting out there looking at me and saying, there's a difference? And the answer to that is yes. We have been told since the ancient Greeks that good is what it is rational to want. Something that is good fulfills its purpose. So when I say, this is a good knife, and then I try to cut a steak, and all the steak does is run around the plate, it's probably not a good knife, because what's a good knife?
Good knife cleanly cuts the meat.
It's sharp. And its purpose is to be sharp and to cut the meat. When we talk about a good person, it becomes much more complex. And we have to start asking if the traits, if this person exhibits the kinds of traits that people want in themselves and in others. When we say good, as Christians, what is good comes from God. And that's why one of the sheets on your table lists something on the order of 600 plus references in Scripture to the word good. 778, sorry, I was way off.
622 is the last one.
When Scripture talks about the good, you will find that over and over again, Old Testament and New Testament, it comes back to the nature of God. A good person is going to be much more complex than a good knife. You've heard people say, "Oh, he's such a good boy. You know, he doesn't rob banks and he doesn't drive cars fast. He's such a good boy." Not robbing banks and not driving cars fast doesn't make you a good person. It just means you don't rob banks and you don't drive cars fast. What makes you a good person is going to be much more complex. What is right? What is the right? Simply put, the right are actions that are in support of the good. If, for Christians, the good is found in the nature of God, and if that good in the nature of God loves human beings, dies for human beings, wants to be in that relationship with human beings, then we can begin to figure out what are the right actions in support of that. Shooting your brother doesn't fall into a right action in support of that good. Now, it's going to get much more complex when we start talking about the end-of-life issues in a practical sense. But the right is in support of the good, and the good for us is grounded in God. And when we talk about, is it right to pull the plug? Is it right to have a DNR? Is it right to withhold or withdraw? Part of our foundation for those decisions is going to be grounded in what is the nature of God, and what does that tell us would be the right thing to do here. A footnote, you remember last spring when my mother-in-law had that attack of acute pancreatitis and was in the hospital for, I don't know, 7 weeks or something like that. And you remember that Ben went down there for a week while my brother-in-law and sister-in-law were going to be out of the country. There was great, both my brother-in-law and sister-in-law are physicians. And they said to Ben that they had great concern because my mother-in-law kept saying, "I'm not afraid to die, I'm not afraid to die." And they had great concerns that her condition was not acute unto death. It was just acute and a pain, but not fatal. And so Ben said that at some point, his mother, he was in the room, his father was in the room, and his mother used this line, which my brother and sister-in-law both said they thought was sort of a cover-up for not having to do the hard work of getting well. And she pulled this line on Ben after the other two were gone. And Ben said that he just looked her right in the eye and he said, "Mom, I know you're not afraid to die. But what if God isn't ready for you right now? And what if you are going to be here for 20 more years? You've got a lot of hard work to do for you to be able to live on this earth and enjoy these next 20 years. And that includes doing this, this, and this, which the doctors had laid out for her to be doing in the bed at that point in her life." Why do I bring that up? The good, which frequently is complex, in this case, my mother-in-law only wanted to see the good as dying and going to be with the Lord. That is a good, no argument. Ben was reminding her that there may be another good in the Lord's arsenal, and that is, you might live for 20 more years, and you'll be an invalid if you don't start right now on the hard work of getting well. What is the right action in support of the good? I firmly believe in that scenario it was Ben looking her right in the eye and giving her the very hard words that if the Lord's not ready for you, You better be ready to be here. And that's, again, why ethical decision-making isn't for the faint-hearted. Now, let me say a few more words about rights. We know, we've used the word rights over and over again in this country. I have my rights, we're fond of saying. Rights, with an S on it, specify acts that are permitted or forbidden. By and large, those acts are permitted or forbidden in support of the good. By and large, we see those rights as part of a social contract. What is our Constitution?
Social contract.
Social contract that's full of rights, okay? We also talk about human rights. We're a little fuzzy at times about human rights, but we talk about them. And we don't use this term all that often. It does come up in the healthcare world. We talk about prima facie rights, and that's just a big, fancy Latin word, or two words, I should say. It simply means at first glance. Prima facie rights mean that these are rights that at first glance are of major importance, but they can end up being outweighed, and you're about to see how that happens. In the world of healthcare, there are 4 traditional principles that govern healthcare professionals, how they engage their patients. And the 4 are autonomy. Let me see if I can get them in the order I'm going to talk about them. I think the next one is beneficence. Okay, thanks. That's all I needed. Beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. Autonomy comes from the Greek. Auto is self, nomos in Greek is law, self-law. Healthcare workers are to help their patient act autonomously based on the patient's values. That last statement assumes that the patient has the capacity to act intentionally. And that means with understanding of their options and without controlling influences which prevent a free, voluntary decision. Autonomy is violated when a patient is treated as a means to someone else's end. The family believes that dear old mom is in a great deal of pain, and we should just end her pain. But mom has said the exact opposite, that she wants to fight, or vice versa. When mom is still completely lucid, she has said, I don't want to fight, and I don't want any intervening measures taken. But the family wants the exact opposite. The rules for informed consent are derived from the principle of autonomy. A patient is to receive all relevant information in a way that he or she can understand. A patient, yes?
I just say, going to add as a healthcare worker,
that this is a very hard principle sometimes.
Yes.
Because it says that people have the right to make bad decisions, and sometimes those bad decisions, are harmful to themselves, but you can't interject your own principle as healthcare world.
Right, and we're also going to come back in a few minutes when we talk about beneficence and non-malfeasance as to how all three of these principles, which are prima facie, can absolutely be in an incredible amount of tension. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but that was a good point. A patient, as I said, to receive all relevant information in a way they can understand. Informed consent says that in order to give informed consent, the patient must be capable of giving permission, meaning that they are mentally capable of understanding and assenting. A patient has to be free of coercion. You can't allow the adult child to be there saying, "Mom, this is so difficult, this is so difficult." Mom's not free of coercion in that case. A person with decision-making capacity, i.e. an autonomous being, is conscious, understands the nature and consequences of what is being asked. That doesn't mean that they understand the medical nitty-gritty, but they are able to converse with you, ask questions, respond, etc. And the patient has the right to refuse. That's part of autonomy. One last point, and then I'm coming right back to you, Ellie. And the patient has to be told the medical consequences of whatever action is being discussed. Ellie.
The thought occurs to me that, for example, with a healthcare proxy, the physician has to make the determination that the patient is unable to do that in order for the proxy to take action. And I think that's difficult.
I think it's difficult. I think a doctor makes that determination. Let me back up. Healthcare proxy. In other words, I'm sick and I have signed a document, Healthcare Durable Power of Attorney, which says that Ben has the right to make decisions on my behalf if I am unable, incapable of making decisions for my course of action. I'm unconscious. I cannot speak, and can't nod, they can't get anything out of me. A determination has to be made that I am unable to participate in that decision making by the doctor in order for that proxy to go into effect so that Ben can make the decisions that he and I have agreed that I want made in the event that that happens. And Ellie is absolutely right. A healthcare professional is going to have to make that call. Now that call, of course, is going to be made based on a number of factors. If I've been in an automobile accident and I am absolutely unconscious and they've got tubes and everything going into me, it's clear that I can't make that decision. It is not as clear when a loved one, for example, has Alzheimer's and their condition is changing. It is not as clear if somebody has had a head injury but they're conscious. And you know, we can go on to many other scenarios like that. Now, that actually, back up. The rules of truthfulness, privacy, confidentiality in the world of healthcare all derive from the principle of autonomy. That confidentiality can be violated by healthcare workers. And let me back up and just say, healthcare workers we're talking about. I just want to remind you all, HIPAA refers to healthcare workers. It does not refer to you and me. Our confidentiality about what is going on with people at Christ Church is based on the fact that we are part of this body of Christ, and we have that respect for each other that I mentioned earlier, and what is good. Discussing that Bill Banks has, I don't know, emphysema.
Getting gray hair.
Getting gray hair, that's a good one. I mean, what is good? Discussing that and telling everybody, oh my God, did you see how gray Bill's hair is? What is right? Matthew 18 says we're not supposed to go out and talk about each other. Okay? But in the world of healthcare, healthcare professionals, and we have two of them present, at least two that I know of, will tell you that, you know, getting on the elevator, having a conversation in the hall with another resident, and then stepping on the elevator and keeping the conversation going and say, well, you know, there's this guy, he's got the salt and pepper hair, he walks on a cane. Actually, you know, he goes to my church. What church do you go to? Christ Church. I'm standing behind them. I'm thinking, okay, is that Dick McCarthy? Healthcare workers have to be very careful because confidentiality can be violated in something as simple as that. This is not going on the internet and saying, Dick McCarthy has to have eye surgery. It's not that obvious. It's often more subtle. Autonomy does not apply to persons who cannot act autonomously, as we've said. Autonomy does not apply to infants, suicidal people, drug-dependent patients, patients with Alzheimer's. Indeed, they may be legitimately controlled on the basis of beneficence and non-malfeasance, but it requires that a healthcare worker think that through carefully before they violate a patient's autonomy. And that is why, at least in Roman Catholic healthcare systems, they have an ethics committee. And part of the responsibility of that ethics committee is to help the healthcare professionals make appropriate decisions, in particular when when the decision suggests the violation of autonomy. Beneficence might be the foundation upon which a healthcare professional puts a suicidal patient in restraints to prevent them from jumping out a window, even though doing so is probably a violation of their autonomy. We can also constrain a person's autonomy when their choices or their actions infringe on the rights of others. Public health is able to say that if you have infectious TB, you should be quarantined. And in the old days, of course, they said that about measles, and various other diseases. Intentionally limiting a patient's autonomy for their own good is called paternalism. That's an example of that is withholding information because you believe it's going to be too upsetting. 60, 70 years ago, diagnosis was cancer. We're not going to tell David that. It would be too upsetting. So David doesn't know why he's losing weight, why he's getting more and more tired. The rest of the family knows, everybody else knows, David doesn't know. Beneficence. I'm going to say a few words about beneficence. We're not going to get past that today, but this is a good start. Beneficence. A healthcare worker has an obligation to promote the health and the welfare of their patient. It is a prima facie duty along with autonomy, and as I said a few minutes ago, right along with non-malfeasance. Respect for autonomy can conflict with beneficence. And a healthcare professional is going to have to determine the patient's best interest. So as I said a minute ago, a patient may be justifiably detained if they are at risk of harming themselves or harming others. And under beneficence, one has to judge whether the benefits of an action outweigh the potential harms. We've got a second. We've already taken some questions. We're going to take questions in just a minute. I'm just going to introduce non-malfeasance. A healthcare professional has an obligation to refrain from doing harm. Indeed, that's been a classic part of the oath for doctors. If a healthcare worker can't bring good, i.e. be a benefit to the patient, then they are bound by duty to at least avoid harm. I think you can begin to see how these first three principles, while they are prima facie, they can create some very difficult moments of decision making, not just for the healthcare professional, but by extension for the family and loved ones of a patient. Erica.
It sounds like, in my experience, that the autonomy outweighs the other ones. And maybe it's because it's not in a Roman Catholic setting. I mean, I don't know if that's true. I could give you many stories. But one that comes to mind is a woman that had a stroke and couldn't do anything. She couldn't talk, but she could communicate through her eyes. And she was in this hellhole of a home. I mean, it was so disgusting. And she had food that would drip on her. And I knew that mice were running on her. I mean, it was that bad. But she was determined to be confident to say that she wanted to live there. And all these other principles, was that in her best interest to stay there? No. I mean, she aspirated. Her autonomy outweighed everything else. It's mind-blowing sometimes.
Well, what also sometimes has to happen in those kinds of scenarios is family and or healthcare professionals have to go beyond the autonomy by going into the legal system.
Well, I mean, that's all. I mean, you report evidence that says this person is autonomous. I mean, that's how that's determined. See, somebody going in and making that decision. But I mean, the system would say, I mean, we're, for the Mexican since we're bound to do something about it, but their autonomy still overrides it. I mean, the doctor made house visits, the family member said we want to have them here. It was a wrong, as far as I'm concerned, a wrong decision, but it's, I mean, to me, autonomy outweighs all those other things in my scope of practice.
And at times, we, as family members, are going to be the ones who are going to have to ask ourselves, how important is this principle to our loved one? What I mean by that is, if I know that Ben is not, well, let's go back to the example. My mother-in-law's autonomy was, yes, she could say, I'm ready to die. If Ben hadn't said anything, would my mother-in-law be here 7 months later? I don't know. But she was not participating as she needed to get well. Did he violate her autonomy? One can argue. Now, I know he's not the healthcare worker, but the flip side is, by his willingness to do that, he helped the healthcare workers be able to get her onto the kind of rehab and therapy that she needed. Ben?
I would make an important point to say that my autonomy is to speak what I think is right.
Good point.
And
good point.
So I did not violate her autonomy at all. I simply said what I thought needed to be said. She didn't do or nothing.
Right. Right.
The other thing I think you did was you gave her the rest of the information that maybe the physicians couldn't give her because maybe they're not supposed to talk about religion. You know, or
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, there's always that. Yes. Yep. It's 10:02, and it's time to stop. Next week, we're going to dig into more of this stuff, and we're going to, among other things, we're going to talk about the sanctity and the quality of life.